Hello, Internet. I am Julian Sanchez with the Cato Institute.
And I'm Matthew Yglesias with the Center for American Progress.
And oddly enough, our extraordinarily news-sensitive topic today is a 35-year-old philosophy book,
Yes.
which basically just gives us an excuse, I think, to geek out on philosophy for 45 minutes. But just because, weirdly, a kind of hot blogospheric
put
topic
into the
last
news.
week, right, was Robert Nozick, who in a really kind of uncommonly bad piece at Slate was, I think, mischaracterized as sort of the forefather or the progenitor of modern libertarianism, which is, I think, clearly untrue despite his great academic influence, and an ex-libertarian, which is also not true, or at least was not true when I spoke to Nozick a few months before he sadly died at the very young age of 63 from stomach cancer. But the main sort of thrust of this was to re-examine an old argument called the Wilt Chamberlain argument from Robert Nozick's seminal.
And we should just to be clear, this was an article by Stephen Metcalf,
right,
in Slate,
who I was mean to in a blog post, and so I think did not want to argue about it, But which actually let me just ask, do you I don't know if you, as obviously the kind of liberal half of this and
Yes.
someone who's less disposed to maybe agree with Nozick on certain issues, maybe you didn't think this was quite as bad as I did. I was interested to see that I feel like even most sort of progressive folks I know who had any kind of philosophy background kind of agreed that this was
I thought, I thought that it was a slightly strange idea to take on it's a real work of academic philosophy. They assign it in classes. I was assigned to read it, and you go over it in that sort of philosophy undergraduate way, with like the very close readings and the back and forth and things like that. As someone who overwhelmingly does, popular journalistic writing,
right.
It's just always seemed to me that it's extremely difficult to come up with, persuasive rebuttals to any kind of, a philosophical argument of the quality that anyone would take seriously enough to assign in school. You
Right.
can't really do a 2,000-word quote unquote takedown of.
Right. Let's just before we ramble too far. Perhaps we should summarize for I'm sure everyone watching at home is well acquainted with the works of Robert Nozick and the Wilt Chamberlain example, but just in case.
So the centerpiece argument that Metcalf didn't like has to do with Wilt Chamberlain, where Nozick starts, I guess, by saying, well, okay, progressive liberal, egalitarian, you're right. We need to have some fair distribution of wealth. And then he asks us to imagine that wealth is fairly distributed, or however that means. And then Wilt Chamberlain comes along, and he's 7 feet tall, he's super athletic, he's far and away the most sort of spectacular basketball performer that anyone has ever seen. And, he wants to play some basketball and let people pay to come see him play. So, he says, give me $1 and come to the arena. And so people do it because, not everyone likes basketball, but lots of us do. It's not that much money. You got to spend it on something. And suddenly, Wilt Chamberlain is super rich. Nozick wants to say, well, look, nobody's done anything wrong here. The distribution of income was fair by hypothesis.
By stipulation,
before.
Right,
by stipulation, whatever it was previously was fair.
The key thing here is he's saying if you think the criteria for economic justice is what he calls a patterned one, right? So if you think the right way to evaluate whether a society is economically just is to compare the distribution to a pattern, whether it's equal shares or the worst off have as much as they can, or
the ratio
right,
of the top to the median. I think there was an N+1 essay maybe a year ago where, in a just kind of offhand way, Mark Greif said no one should be allowed to earn over $100,000.
Right.
Which even you could take that as a proposal of this kind, but then
sure.
say it somehow turns out
that's a weak pattern, but
right. But I mean, if you have the pattern and it's fair, and then people voluntarily, a large number of people want to transfer a small amount of money to Wilt Chamberlain, then who has been wronged?
Right, and so the idea is that and in a way this is a dilemma and so this is the important thing to realize here is that Metcalfe thinks this 4-page thought experiment that occurs in the middle of a 300-page book is supposed to justify basically laissez-faire capitalism because the representative market relation in a modern capitalist society is captured by the example of Wilt Chamberlain, which would be a stupid argument if that's what Nozick was saying. It's not, of course, what Nozick is saying. The upshot of this argument is not that this is somehow realistic or even that this argument justifies capitalism. It's that it's a narrow argument about what the method of evaluating economic justice should be. And Nozick's argument is just that to have a end-state pattern that said, that is to say, to have a pattern criteria that says, look at the distribution and does it look too unequal? And just by looking at the shape of that distribution, you have a sense of how just the society is. He said that's wrong. That omits the importance of how a distribution arises. And so, and again, his objection here is, look, if you have a theory on which it follows that from a by stipulation fair distribution, according to whatever principle of patterning you think is correct, you can arrive, or you can transition from a perfectly just situation to a very unjust situation. Again, not because this is because real market transactions necessarily are like, but if even in principle or in theory, your view allows a perfectly just situation to be transformed into an unjust one by a series of steps that involve nothing but people making free choices with the assets that by stipulation they are entitled to, that there's something wrong with that theory, that it can't be the case. Which I do find plausible in the context of the specific claim that he's making. But I will note, I think actually, in a way, is almost arguably question-begging. Right? So, it's clearly the case.
Right. I was always going to say that, to me, the problem with the argument as it stands out there is simply that it's not very clear what it's a response to. In
right.
terms of an actual view that people hold. I will definitely concede as a political blogger that, people, when writing loosely, very frequently kind of find a chart and it shows the exploding income share
right.
of the top 1%, and they put it out and they're like, income inequality is exploding and this is bad. And it does seem that maybe that's implicitly an appeal to a so-called pattern theory, or who knows, though, exactly what it is. But I don't think that anyone, or few major people that I can think of, when they're setting down an explicit account of what they're trying to say about, a fair distribution of resources, do put forward any kind of idea that there's some pattern at which everyone's holdings become completely legitimate. That the more common position is to say that a fair set of institutions
right.
would have a certain kind of impact on the distribution of economic resources, and those institutions presumably include the tax system as part of it. So, so we all have our money, but we don't have that kind of strong claim to the money. We have the money in virtue of our participation in a set of economic institutions, and one of those institutions is the fact that Wilt Chamberlain might need to pay taxes.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and there's a couple issues. So one thing is that Nozick, I think, kind of bundles together a couple claims. He kind of closes with this rhetorical flourish about how, and so what this shows is that people's free choices will upset the pattern, and so to be continuously realized, any pattern would require continuous interference with people's free choices. I think this is sort of,
well, he says that like it's
a
crazy thing, right? Like, imagine being constantly interfered with, but actually, like, every time you go to the store and buy a pack of gum, like, the grasping arm of the state is in there. And, I mean, you might think that's bad, but it's not it's not like it would be a weird experience that is alien to our actual lives.
Right. Well, and also, I think the objection to continuous interference, so since we know in practice, like the way redistributive institutions work is also not that they kind of like are micromanagerial, but there's a kind of more general your income is taxed, and then there's a system of redistribution as opposed to some kind of micromanaging of your choices. That objection doesn't really have any force independent from the argument that in fact the transition to a potentially unequal distribution because freely chosen is just. I mean, if you thought it was unjust, it would be like, every time someone is the victim of fraud or a tort, like, the legal system continuously interferes to rectify the injustice. Not again, every second, but everyone thinks that kind of continuous interference is legitimate insofar as, there are, every day some number of fraudulent or tortious actions that happen. I was thinking, I'm curious because in general I know we're both also fans of Derek Parfit, and while again I find this account somewhat compelling, kind of as just against sort of the potted view that like maybe people do not seriously hold, on reflection, but the kind of instinctive maybe view that just that you can look at a distribution and say, well, it seems very unequal. And then somehow that is in itself proof that there's something unjust, as opposed to asking how did the distribution come about, and it may historically be that it's very unequal for reasons involving injustice, but that you can't just look at that. However, it does seem to. It seems like this is the part that I think is maybe question begging. The presumption seems to be that essentially injustice has to be a microphenomenon. That if you have a series of actions that lead to a result, all of those actions being individually just, then the macro upshot of all those decisions in self somehow like inherits the legitimacy of the micro decisions. And we understand. I think we understand in a lot of cases. That, and Parfit famously had an example called the harmless torturers, involving an elaborate setup I won't get into, but Google that, it's fun. But the easy case here is, right, look, it might be the case that there are thousands of people who are involved in industry emitting different kinds of chemicals, and individually any one of them, the atmosphere is really big, and so they correctly say, well, my emission in itself is not doing any real harm to anyone. It's not, it's not like coming down around me and causing people to have to breathe smog. It just disperses in the atmosphere, but it mixes with all the other chemicals. And thousands of people doing this over time create some kind of ecological catastrophe. This is, again, sort of like just assume the thought experiment, regardless of what you folks at home might think about. The state of climate science, just let's stipulate that this is a possible thing. And the only, so what you would want to say here then is that despite the fact that everyone can correctly say, just like, my individual vote isn't going to make the difference, my individual participation or not in emission, does not make the difference between whether the ecological catastrophe happens, has no real, detectable marginal effect, and yet you want to say everyone involved in this is somehow acting wrongly. But what makes it wrong is not the properties of their action in itself, but the contribution of their action to the collective effect given what everyone else is doing. And you might actually want to kind of go back in and say, with reference to the pattern, there's a principle that says, in fact, your individual action was not just, after all, once you combine it with the actions of others and take account of that, which is to say, once you take account of the pattern. Because Nozick also, kind of recognizes you can say you could have an individual principle of justice in transfer that somehow embeds the pattern, and he says, well,
right. I mean that's why
he
makes it that the transfers are all small.
Right.
But I mean it's essentially sort of just a denial, that there can be collective sort of collective acts of wrongdoing, which seems wrong. If you think about pollution or, tossing a grain of sand, on somebody's lot, can't be like a serious harm. But if it creates an avalanche,
right?
I mean, people have reasons to want to control even very minor individual actions if it's the case that everybody doing it would produce some kind of intolerable situation. And I mean, this is where I mean, I don't know the extent to which this is what Metcalfe meant or not, but I think it's true that you get a certain bleed over of ideas that come out of a theoretical realm and that have certain precise kinds of claims and that then get taken over into people's popular consciousnesses about what it is that they're doing. And I mean, to me, that would be at least the interesting claim to make about this Wilt Chamberlain example. I mean, if you go to see, the managers of heavily regulated and implicitly subsidized and occasionally bailed out banks, and they are making millions of dollars a year, and they resent sort of anti-banker sentiment and Barack Obama calling for high taxes. I mean, is one of the things, people are saying, like, that these guys, they've got to read their Nozick. I mean, possibly they are, and possibly they're not. I mean, certainly Ayn Rand, for example, has I wouldn't even say necessarily that, the best possible reading of the ideas in Ayn Rand's book has a large influence on American public policy or anything like that. But these sort of images and metaphors and lines from Atlas Shrugged definitely have some impact in our political culture.
In a way, I feel very confident that Anarchy, State, and Utopia, for better or worse, does not. But
right. I mean, I don't know. And it's what I thought. I mean, I thought one of the interesting assertions that Metcalfe made that I think is only sort of right was about the fact that Nozick, later in his life, had sort of moved away from the claims that were even put forward in this book. But the book the book lives on in part because I think professors teaching political philosophy want it to be the case that there is a very strong philosophical claim made for a kind of extreme free market view. It's pedagogically useful.
It's like why people teach Daniel Dennett in like philosophy of mind classes. Nobody really agrees with him, but everyone wants to have like the Dennett position as a foil to whatever else.
Right. But I mean, I actually think this is a problem when talking about political philosophy, because things happen in politics on multiple levels simultaneously. And I think there are a lot of very real, very important, very practically and intellectually influential arguments that people believe, about empirical economics that drive, real political disputes, but that the kind of considerations that you find in Anarchy, State, Utopia, I think, are just not that important. And certainly my impression, I was a student in the last class that Nozick taught, which wasn't directly on a political theory subjects, but certainly touched on them.
This is the class he did on the Russian Revolution.
On the Russian Revolution, yeah, was that, in his own thinking about this, that he was definitely a libertarian. I mean, he would call himself a libertarian if you asked him, but that he was much more shaped in that by, say, Milton Friedman's ideas than even by the ideas in Anarchy, State, Utopia. That, I mean, he wasn't going to say about the Russian Revolution that the giant land holdings of,
Right,
aristocratic serf lords, right, that represented just holdings, that there was some...
Well, that's not certainly no libertarian would say that.
Well, right. I don't think
Tsarist
anybody...
Russia is not a libertarian paradise.
Right. And so if the question becomes, if Nozick thinks that the right strategy for Russia, is perhaps to have a political revolution and then to create a libertarian state, the basis for that has to be he advanced claims about, had us read things about the socialist calculation problem, and also, I think to try to persuade college students, who might be more inclined toward left-wingery, just the fact that if the government controls the key levers of economic life, then it makes it impossible to have meaningful political freedom. Is an argument he put forward that I think has some purchase. The movie The Lives of Others that a lot of people saw makes that point clear, that if even though in America it sometimes seems like, well, rich people's control over economic resources subverts political democracy, that if you have the political office holders also controlling all the economic resources, then you really...
different level of,
and so, those to me, are good points. I think they were points that, were, important to him. They're certainly, they don't, push you toward an extreme libertarian view, but they militate in that direction. Mm-hmm. But none of them really have anything to do with these claims about property rights and Lockean acquisition and just transfer, because there's no... it's just false of the history of humanity to say that property was acquired in this way.
Right. And the interesting is that he works up this somewhat, well, in some ways elaborate and in some ways, kind of very underdeveloped. And there's a lot of, despite these copious footnotes, there's a lot of kind of citation-needed sections in anarchist utopia, and he highlights them. There are lots of places where he is, kind of very forthcoming about saying, here is the structure of how an account of appropriate entitlements to economic holdings would work, and this is a part I'm not going to work out deeply, and I'm going to kind of gesture toward what the argument would look like, but that's sort of to be continued. The full working out of this is would be the task for another book, but. Right. It's also clearly the case that we are for the most part not appropriating things out of the state of nature, and so Nozick himself actually kind of in a footnote somewhere says something like, given that actually existing property holdings do not originate historically in any kind of unbroken chain of Lockean appropriation, maybe what you would need at the outset is some kind of actual kind of big reshuffling of holdings, and then after that, you sort of say, okay, year zero, effect, and now.
So it's almost. He's the one, I think, rather than the conventional modern liberal egalitarian, who actually needs the pattern theory.
In a sense, and I think
because if he had one that was good,
right,
then he could say, well, what we need to do is establish the pattern.
Right, and from there, free transactions.
We roll forward the Wilt Chamberlain universe, right? But it's extremely difficult to say what that would mean in practice. To the extent that I think most of us would say we have good, in the conventional American sense of the term, free market-y reasons to think that we would all wind up worse off if we tried to completely reshuffle property holdings. That everyone's... Well, for one thing, the way it goes now, the people who own businesses typically know something about the business.
Right.
Right? And if you randomly assign... I might like some of the money that Steve Jobs has,
but you don't actually
virtue of owning Apple. But
right.
I don't want to run Apple. I wouldn't be able to do it. And I wouldn't benefit in any meaningful sense over the long haul from being put in charge of farms I can't operate and things like that. So we kind of row along, and it's I think it's important biographically, and it's important ideologically, and in a way it's important philosophically that Nozick also had, I think, pretty right-wing views about economics disputes. That if he was reading Paul Krugman columns, and then he was reading Tyler Cowen columns, he would be inclined to agree with Tyler Cowen's columns, which are disputes about economics. But that if you sort of had the anarchy state utopia doctrine in your mind, but you also had this problem of the just acquisitions, and then you also thought that the world is shot through with market failures, that it's relatively simple for good-willed people to build effective public institutions, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I don't know that would really make you a libertarian at all, if you were just a kind of, I don't know, liberal person who thought some kind of property was good, who thought that actual property in the United States mostly stems from having killed all these Indians. So it's, and I mean that was I guess part of the, I don't know. So while you can
imagine an argument that says something like you have a principle of rectification to try and amend historical injustices, to the extent that there is an imperfect sort of chain of holdings that. It might be the case, for example, that the apartment I'm sitting in, is somehow at some point land seized by bloodshed from native inhabitants, and that's wrong. But that insofar as it's basically impossible to. I mean, over a period of a couple hundred years, it's just the counterfactual is who would exist if that had not happened, and who deserves the stuff back. And you say, well, you can't rectify it. So the fact that over time, many people not directly responsible for the illegitimate part of the taking have, in fact, mixed their labor or in other ways have expended effort and homesteaded the land. And so, despite the break in the just chain, insofar as it's basically impossible to remedy, in a direct way, in a find the person who really deserves that land way, that you say basically at some point, people not responsible for the wrong effectively reappropriated in a way that would be actually consonant with, so no one recognized it. It's not like there was a point at which the legal system somehow took note of the fact that this had happened. It had taken the, illegitimate seizure as the legitimate point of transfer, but that, morally speaking, there is some point at which, so what passes for a legitimate appropriation occurred.
But the problem is that you don't just have a kind of a one-off, native inhabitants kind of thing. Right. You have a sort of a continuing series of sometimes things that are uncontroversially unjust, slavery, et cetera. But you also just have a lot of stuff going on in, regulation, in real estate law, in transfers of this kind of thing from one person to the other. And I mean, I forget. If you think not about Wilt Chamberlain, but about an actual high-paid NBA star, LeBron James is not primarily earning his money sort of selling tickets to come see him in person. He's so highly paid because he is a key performer in sort of copyrighted television broadcasts, which is it's a creature of the state. The whole setup of broadcast television in the United States is a very sort of state-led thing. I don't personally, begrudge him his fortune, in part because he does pay quite high taxes on it. But when you're looking at real examples of rich people, it tends to be kind of bound up in one way or another with a state framework, and that leaves you with the policy question, really, I think, of whether you are making people better off or not by, putting the squeeze to them, or whether, you can plausibly say in many of these cases that if we had less state interference in the economy, some of these rich people wouldn't be as rich, that they're, standing on the choke points. But like that's it's not a philosophical argument.
Right. Well, so I think you maybe think so I think I would certainly agree that in practice philosophy does not seem to be that directly relevant in the sense of being efficacious in shaping political outcomes, at least not directly or consciously. I think Keynes was probably right that philosophy matters more than we think. This is the sort of the practical man or the slaves of some defunct academic scribbler, in the sense that, not that people are consciously trying to realize the difference principle or Nozick's entitlement theory, but that, people almost don't even realize the extent to which they're thinking about justice.
I think that's probably true. It's just that it means that if you're having an influence, the influence probably doesn't have that much to do with what, technically speaking, your arguments do and don't show, right? So if you think about the early 70s context for this, right, that we had sort of built in the United States, a Cold War liberalism had become sort of very politically influential, but I think was felt by many people to be a little bit of a unprincipled mishmash, that it was not nearly as market-oriented as classical liberalism. It wasn't nearly as thoroughgoing as communism, which there were then, there were lots of Marxists around in the early 70s. And so John Rawls produces a book that raises the social prestige of Cold War liberalism, even though that's not what it's quote-unquote about. And then a few years later, in a project that was ultimately more politically and socially successful, Robert Nozick writes a book that raises the social and cultural prestige of something much more like a classical liberalism. And I think you can dispute exactly whether these different books entail those things logically, but it's clear from reading the writing that that's what they mean, and you can see it in little editorial choices, right? Like Theory of Justice takes this detour to talk about the justification for civil disobedience, which is clearly that's clearly something Rawls does because the civil rights movement is on his mind at the time, whereas a person writing later, it stands out if you read it today that he doesn't say anything about feminism, or other topics that present-day people kind of care about. And Nozick, if you've seen any of his rather scant popular writings or just talked to him, he liked he affiliated himself with the libertarian movement, in a broader kind of way than just the philosophical arguments there. He was convinced by the economics. He liked the politics. So, that does seem influential to me, but it also just means that these kind of precise argumentative tools can be a bit of kind of dangerous weapons.
That ends up not being kind of what makes the difference. I will say, actually, though, I think, you're kind of suggesting, and I think we've talked about this in other contexts, that ultimately these sort of philosophical, you were saying this, at the end of the day, Nozick's final views had as much to do with Milton Friedman as any kind of, Lockean or Kantian rights view. And I think, so let me attribute to probably a position perhaps more extreme than you actually hold, but that at the end of the day, the interesting disputes are not about competing theories of justice or various views about rights as strong side constraints in state action, but fundamentally empirical questions of economics and social science, where if it turns out that stronger property and whatever more robust free market institutions are what in the long haul cause social welfare to increase, then that's sort of the dispositive argument for them. And to the extent that that's not true, you do something different. I want to push back a little bit on this because I think, look, I'm not as radical as Nozick was in 1974 either. So I don't think taxation for anything beyond some kind of absolutely minimal state is just exactly morally equivalent to robbery and slavery. But I do, I'm also as a pluralist, I do think there are like competing values, and so sometimes some mild diminution in liberty can be kind of justified or compensated by huge gains somewhere else. But I also think, in a way that I almost find kind of odd, that it seems like sort of economic liberals just don't, say, folks on the left, progressives, just don't seem to think has any weight at all, is that at the end of the day, not because there's some kind of unbroken historical chain of Lockean appropriation and transfer of physical assets, but because economic production and sort of the social surplus is, at the end of the day, overwhelmingly kind of the upshot or product of people's productive energy, that when you appropriate resources and money, which is, again, kind of labor concretized in a sense, if you want to be slightly Marxist about it, and more generally, when to achieve a goal, however independently just it might be, when you either conscript people's resources and energy, or require them to behave in a certain way in order to accomplish this, that whether or not this is a dispositive objection, whether or not it is a trump, in the sense Nozick talked about side constraints that are a absolutely decisive argument against intervention, that in general, that coercion is a morally bad thing. And so even if you have a good thing you want to do with the money you raise from tax revenue, that you at least have to factor in the idea that it is morally bad to take people's resources and tell them we're going to do X with it, unless there's some kind of compelling reason to say this is a very important thing that cannot be done any other way for some reason, and it's really necessary, and sort of everyone benefits, and okay, but that you don't kind of pretend you're not doing something that is morally suboptimal, and that in an ideal world it would be, it would be better to have people do things voluntarily than have them be forced to do it.
Yeah, well, I guess I think there's like two kinds of versions of that, right? One, which is, I think, the view that Nozick sketches in Invariances, is kind of relying on a coercion is bad principle, rather than a view that's about property as such.
Yes.
Right?
That's right.
And so I think that does have a fair amount of purchase to it. But again, I think that it's, so there's a cultural value in the United States, a notion out there, which is like people have money in the bank account, wealthy people in particular have a lot of it.
They do in particular.
And then they feel resentment at the idea of needing to pay high or higher levels of taxes on it, right? And I just don't really think that if people who were wealthy were to think in a very serious way about how much wealth they would really have had if we really had a night watchman state all along, that level of resentment is really justified, in most of these cases. That it's interesting to talk about whether it would or would not be desirable to move to a state like that. But, particularly, in part this involves taking a turn, but if you think about the pollution and stuff that's involved with industrial activity as entailing, to some extent, the factory owner dumping soot on my space, you start to raise real questions in people's minds about what is it we're really saying that we should be doing here. Now, on the other hand, I do think the idea that we should try to make coercion a less prominent feature in life does have some purchase. But if you think about what it, in the world, it just sometimes becomes, I think, tricky to say, right? That, I mean, if you have some bleeding heart liberals out there who like want to take your money and use it to build preschools because we have all this research that says, well, if we have these quality preschools, you know, there's going to be less crime, and then there's also going to be less people in prison, and you know, that can become like a very squishy, like Jew the Schklar, you know, cruelty is bad kind of view. You know, so I mean, again, I think it's nice for people to sort of develop more delicate moral sensibilities, you know, I mean, around coercion, among other things. But how that's really gonna go, it seems really vague to me.
Well, I mean, I think you sound a little bit like you were flirting with the kind of argument that Tom Nagel and Liam Murphy make in The Myth of Ownership, and that I think Ronald Dworkin has made. I mean, this is, I think, has become in the last decade or so. I mean, it arguably sort of stretches back to kind of Robert Hill and sort of this proto-law and economics kind of analysis of market institutions, but seems to me at least to have in the last decade or so become prominent again. Which is an argument to the effect that, look, holdings of, you know,
that property is a creation of the state,
and then so there is no, and insofar as state institutions and courts and contract enforcement and rights protection and all these things create a framework that enables, you know, all the sort of wealth that people acquire, that it is in some sense incoherent to talk about your pre-tax income as something to which you're entitled, which is taken away because but for the structure supported by tax revenue, we would all be at a sort of a much lower general point, which I see sort of the force of that to some extent, but the two things are there's obviously one, huge amounts of the tax money we pay go to things that have no, you know, conceivable plausible connection to, and, you know, creating the framework that allows us to generate wealth. I mean, so you could, I mean, I think
I think it's great for people to feel resentment at the idea of being asked to contribute money to pointless projects, right? I mean, that makes, but that's resentment about waste.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I do think it's fair to say, look, but for, you know, a public school system or something, like, you would have a lot more criminals and a lot less educated people to work and produce and grow the larger pie. So, you know, don't be resentful about being taxed, you know, your money to pay for public schools, because to some extent I mean, this just, I'm kind of sort of, let's assume for the moment that's true. I don't, you know, we can argue about whether a market schooling system, you know, really would be sort of radically worse in some way, but kind of, you can see an argument where, given, you know, you're stipulating that public school has all these sort of spillover effects. If that were the case, then it would be sort of churlish to complain about taxation if the income really were in some way dependent on having that kind of system. And fair enough. On the other hand, I mean, it just seems to me that this is an argument. I mean, I can imagine a precisely parallel kind of argument in the case of something like free speech, where you say, well, look, your ability to speak freely is dependent in all these ways on a state system that protects and enforces that right, and that creates all these institutions that allow you to have, you know, your nice internet and your blogging heads TV.
Yeah, but I mean, I actually do think that is one of the reasons why, at certain margins, these kind of like hand-wavy exemptions to free speech start popping up. Mm-hmm. That it's like, you know, why don't I have a free speech right to like run around Q Street like screaming at 4 a.m, and it comes down to the fact that, you know, we're protecting free speech because it's important to have free speech, but it's not actually important for me to have the right to yell on Q Street at 4 a.m. in a residential neighborhood, even though, or then conversely, right, like we don't engage in heavy-handed censorship of campaign advertising. Even though, in a kind of a literal sense, that whole thing is I mean, there's a strong case that like that really is just a creature of the state. I mean, television broadcasts and you get these free FCC licenses, but I mean, relatively open exchange of political ideas is not the only thing that's important about free speech, but it's like close to the core of the concept. So we edge very, very far away from it, whereas like kids being loud is like very, very far from the essence. So we, you can't just like open a rock club wherever you want. So I don't know.
You're doing a case where like the physical noise is disruptive in a way that has nothing to do with the content of. I mean, it wouldn't matter if you were running around Q Street at 4 a.m, like screaming passages from a theory of justice. It would
right. But I mean, yeah.
That's just purely about the kind of the harm to others of the like kind of like physical properties of
the place
noise
and manner,
late at night, right? Not
they call it.
That is I believe the term of art. But I mean that seems like a sort of a somewhat orthogonal sort of
I guess
issue.
I mean to me it shows that there's a pragmatism to it, to all these kind of rights. But okay, so wait, this is what I wanted to say about coercion and property, which is that in my, I would say, like practical experience, talking about political issues and talking to people about political issues, people experience any change in what they're entitled to as kind of coercive. Right. So that if you suddenly have to start paying higher taxes, people are upset about that. But, people who sort of had like an understanding that they would have this like monopoly privilege from the New York Taxi and Limousine Commission,
right,
are also very upset that Bloomberg is freeing that market. And people, right. There was a sort of a Tea Party group in Virginia that was mobilizing against more mixed-use zoning near the Virginia Rail Express stations because, and I mean, I don't sympathize with the taxi claim or with the mixed-use zoning claim, but it is sort of pragmatic. I mean, I see what they're saying, right? I mean, their view on this is, well, we moved here and we bought this house and we did this thing with a certain understanding about what the place was going to be like. And so we want the right to veto any kind of change to our external environment. And you have that all the time in this city. I mean, some people want to open a Mexican restaurant on 15th and P, and some people who live on that block, think it's going to be tacky and people are going to be loud, and so they don't want it. And personally, I have what's a very libertarian view on these subjects, and I'm constantly annoying people about it. But the psychic mechanism of like resentment and entitlement strikes me as basically identical to the tax one, and that in both cases it's important to try to persuade people, about the sort of the practical outcomes, that you have to do these things. You have to change things sometimes to make the world a better place.
Right. I mean, this is, I think, something the idea that sort of traditional coming to the nuisance doctrine and common law, that, part of your kind of property enjoyment is in fact stuff like if you bought a house and there was not a huge factory next to it when you moved in, that there's some sense in which the factory opening up is interfering with a kind of component of the property right that you were entitled to expect in a way that wouldn't be the case if you had built your house next to a factory. But no, I think that's probably right. I mean, so one question I know we've sort of batted around a bit among ourselves is how much does philosophy matter to practical politics in a conscious way? I mean, you say again, or unconscious. I mean, it does seem like by and large, it's these things that sort of trickle down in a way. So you'll have people who might not know the name John Rawls, who will kind of talk in terms he framed about whether a social structure is benefits the worst off most. Although actually you don't actually hear people talk about the middle class. No one actually seems to be willing politically to say that the test is whether particular social institutions are of the greatest benefit to those at the very bottom of the ladder. But it's funny, you see on the right, to some extent, you see a sort of self-conscious interest in I guess what you might call political philosophy. Not in the again sort of the what policy is best sense, but in the more abstract sense. But it's they'll talk about the founders who were sort of brilliant men and brilliant political economists in a sense, but it's not really philosophy in the sense we mean. And then you'll see again some sort of a level of interest in Ayn Rand, who is sometimes somewhat interesting, but it's not, I don't think, she's sort of a pop novelist who had some philosophical ideas batted around. It's not really good. I mean, it's not something you would if she had not written novels that had exciting sex in rock quarries and adventure and lasers.
People wouldn't care.
Right. If somebody you just had her philosophical ideas, like no one would teach those in a university class. But on the right, at least, it seems like there's some kind of interest in this abstract thinking about what justice requires and what was moral. Whereas on the, I don't know if I see that as much on the left. I mean, there's a sense that there is a moral imperative that people have health care or that the distribution be less unequal of economic holdings. But it's more, it seems to me that in general it's more, people are badly off and that's terrible and morally we ought to do something, but there's less of a sense that we need to find a kind of philosophical as opposed to sort of pragmatic, theory that will explicate specifically what people are entitled to as a matter of justice. How much health care, which actually seems like really important, right? I mean, if you're actually going to do it and say we're going to have a system that will pay for health care, it seems like suddenly it actually becomes incredibly important to start talking about things like to what extent, because you can pay $500,000 to keep someone for 3 more months on a ventilator, and you do sort of have to start saying things like, given finite resources, what does justice require us, to the extent you think it requires anything?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an interesting sociological gap in those terms, which I think is very real, and I wonder how much it persists internationally, or is an American phenomenon, because the American political context has some different sort of idiosyncratic features. Ideological self-identification of Democratic Party voters is much more diverse than on the Republican side. So Republican presidential candidates all say, I'm the conservative candidate in the race.
Right.
And their voters all self-identify as conservatives. So the question, what is conservatism? What's the conservative take on this? Has a lot of purchase, whereas Democrats are much more split between people. You can poll it different ways, but a lot of them say they're moderates, and others will say they're progressives or say they're liberals. They did some poll where it was I think 25% of the overall population said socialism is a good idea. Those people are presumably voting for the Democratic Party. So there's a strong incentive to stay away from any kind of foundational or theoretical questions, and create as much of a, to just sort of say, as President Obama has really gone all in on this notion that he descends from the mountaintops free of ideology, and is merely looking to solve problems in a practical way. And if those solutions happen to normally line up with the ideological predispositions of the people who are inclined to vote for him, that's a convenient, happenstance. To some extent, that's a personal tick of his, but to some extent, it's a response to the objective situation. It would be extremely difficult to win an election in the United States as an avowed believer in left-wing politics. But you also don't want to run around knocking the deeply held ideas of people you're counting on voting.
Well,
for.
apparently the Obama administration does. I mean, that seems they
Yeah,
had
I
a
mean,
big hippie punching kind of phase.
They definitely do. I mean, sure, to an extent, but it's like you're never going to hear like Barack Obama just like say, oh, a lot of people say income inequality is bad, but actually I don't care about it.
Right.
You know, I mean, even if he doesn't, right? I mean, because a lot of people do care, and so you know, he's just always gonna, you know, kind of thread needles, and this is something, you know, liberal writer types talk about amongst ourselves endlessly. Like, would it be better to have, you know, mass ideological re-education programs? But
really?
You know, I mean, just for like even like for our own side,
yes.
you know, and it always winds up. We have a guy, John Halpin, who does a small program at CAP based on this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but I find that I like John a lot, but I think we actually disagree about a lot of things to the extent that, like, you know, it's weird. It's like we agree about a lot of policy questions, but are not necessarily all that aligned in what the like deep structure of that is.
I was going to actually, I mean, maybe one reason for the difference, and I don't know how much this is representative of the right, but I know certainly, you know, in college, if you were, you know, someone who was, you know, kind of remotely sort of interested in libertarian ideas, you know, you would get invited to one of these summer seminars that the Institute for Humane Studies does, you know, funded by the, you know, the Evil Koch brothers or something like that, but does at colleges all around the country, and I went to a couple of these, and they were very, you know, they were interesting, but it's like, you know, you go for a week, and it's not, you know, this is a seminar in how to, like, you know, sit in a tree or do practical activism, although, you know, a little of that. It's, we're going to sit down and we're going to read some Hayek and some von Mises and, you know, Bastiat and John Stuart Mill and maybe Nozick, and to just talk about the sort of, you know, in part about economics, but also about philosophy. And so, I mean, you find, I mean, I think if you're going to go around the kind of the libertarianish right in D.C., certainly, you know, you'll be hard-pressed to find someone who did not at some point have, you know, at least some contact with that system. And so there's at least, I mean, I can kind of walk up to, you know, anyone at one of these institutions and refer kind of in passing maybe to Anarchy, State, and Utopia or to something from Hayek's Constitution of Liberty in a way that you know, books that are perhaps not widely read in the general population, but that I know that within this ideological subgroup, I can be pretty confident there's a good chance you've read that, or at least will recognize certain references in a way that I don't know if, in general, on the left, you can just sort of refer in passing to, you know, the difference principle, you know, falling out of the original position in a way that. I mean,
it's hard to say, you know, because
now,
actually, like, conventional, like, humanistic college education,
right, just include that now.
Involves a lot of, well, but in particular, I mean, what's interesting is that it involves a lot of far left ideas that have, you know, that like stand apart from practical American politics, right? That like I was assigned, among other things, but like I was assigned a fair amount of Karl Marx's writing. I was assigned some, you know, like radical queer theory stuff, you know, that has like really nothing to do with what like the Center for American Progress is going to put out next week. You know, we're not gonna do Judith Butler or anything like that. So there's this kind of it's like both more mainstream to get that information, but it has less to do with like people's political activities.
Right. Do you think that is a bad thing or a healthy thing, or?
I don't know. I mean, you know, I think it's always good for people to sort of know more. But I actually think, I mean, I do think that it's kind of a problem for the right, that there's a tendency to for people to engage in too much slightly sloppy reasoning from first principles, rather than acknowledging how little that's really going to get them. If you want to develop like a strong opinion about something,
Right.
That
No, I think that's right.
that it's really hard to read off an opinion about. I mean, given that there's already a healthcare system and it's already not a free market healthcare system, if there's then a proposal to change it, I just don't think that like reading von Mises, it's really hard for that to shed any light on the merits of the change.
I mean, so this is I'm very sympathetic to the argument Amartya Sen puts out in his recent book, The Idea of Justice, that we have a kind of tradition, at least in the West, of philosophy that's very focused on ideal theory and sort of constructing a picture of what a kind of perfectly just society or basic structure would look like, or what kind of what a society would look like, kind of built on scratch on a desert island, according to correct moral principles, but it doesn't actually sort of tell you where to go from here. And I mean, it's what he says something like, "Look, it may be the case that the ideal painting in the world is the Mona Lisa, but if your choice is between, Picasso and Dali, that's not very instructive." I also thought, I mean, it's just striking in terms of the way it seems to have fallen. I think it's worth saying that, like, so this Slate piece that started this conversation is about a book that won a National Book Award when it came out in 1974. That was in response to a book that was at the time hugely influential, and you would go to parties and people would be talking about Rawls and Nozick, and you would at least have to kind of pretend you had read a little bit of it or something like that.
Sure.
In a way that if you go to like France now, like philosophers are celebrities in this weird way. But now, if we want to talk about philosophy in American politics, you have this Slate piece that's talking about a book that's 37 years old. And there is good stuff. I know we're both reading Derek Parfit's excellent new book on what matters in 2 volumes. The second thicker even than the one I'm holding up. And he's a really interesting ethical thinker who I think has a lot to say. And as sort of ex-philosophy majors, we can sort of sit on the porch and geek out about this. But there's no sense, I think, that in a way that would have been the case, re Rawls and Nozick in the 70s, that in general, someone who is not just kind of narrowly a philosophy geek, but someone who's just interested in politics and morality and the idea of what justice.
Yes, nobody here is wondering
right.
whether or not Parfit's conclusions at the end of this book about the right way to look at time horizon and the persistence of the human race is going to alter the climate and energy reform debate in Congress, even though it does directly bear on it in some ways.
I mean, even though I know it happened in the 80s I don't remember which, there were European parliaments where literally, like on the floor, like a point of contention between 2 kind of leftish politicians was whether or not some legislation they were going to pass was consonant with the difference principle, which is, unfathomable to be in American politics really at any time. But and I guess in a way,
but even in fairly rarefied circles in America, people don't take those kind of ideas and intellectuals as such all that seriously. Although in part that's because they don't in other countries have this kind of vast superstructure of like para-intellectuals like you and me, who we live in the nation's capital and we work at these like political institutions, but we're not like writing legislation. You know what I mean? There's this sort of demi-monde that there's much less of in European countries. So I think people out of actual academia move into a void to an extent.
I mean, but the funny thing is we are actually seeing this renaissance of an attempt to, so you would actually now see on the floor of Congress, right, like people debating in a way that they probably wouldn't have 10 years ago. Well, is this consistent with the philosophy of the founders? And you might see invocations of
we love the founders in America.
But yeah, it's not, it's interesting to me again that, like, if you're trying to point to philosophy really as opposed to economics or social science, it's hard to think of really on either side figures that Ronald Dworkin has this sort of like sinecure with the New York Review of Books, and we'll turn out sort of kind of, I think, mostly sort of sloppy essays that I think kind of go the other way, to take his policy preferences and try and construct some kind of theoretical framework for why they're directly required by first principles. But
I mean, we had Leon Cass for a little while,
right?
There was a kind of a vogue for him in popular writing. I mean, Amartya Sen is a well-known intellectual figure, writes things in the popular press that comes down. But I don't know. I mean, it may be a difference that, we do have a country that was founded by these, you wouldn't call them philosophers, but they were intellectuals.
Sort of, yeah.
I mean, Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton, most of those guys were real writers and thinkers,
right,
in the context of their time. And their books continue to be interesting. I mean, I don't think anyone ever reads them and says, well, this is like literally correct and I'm going to follow it in all paths. But I mean, they're interesting to read. It's not the same as like reading a congressional floor speech from 1920, which might be of historical interest, but no intellectual importance. The Federalist Papers are genuinely thought-provoking ideas about political institutions. So we often make reference to them. I mean, David Brooks just the other day, I thought was saying, well, we need a Hamiltonian approach, and then there was like an M dash, and he like listed 4 things that he thought should be done. And that's a fairly conventional mode of argument in the United States, this way and that, and maybe that's what we have. Other countries, France was founded by like a guy with a sword, hundreds of years ago. So they have to separate out, like sort of political leaders from thinker types. We have this like endless cottage industry of biographies of the founding fathers in the United States that are, I think, a culturally important, like influential way of thinking about things.
Mm-hmm.
So
is this? I guess one way. Why do you think that? We don't say, so even within the U.S., which maybe has never been, sort of like France on this score, and maybe that's a good thing. But you don't see that same kind of role for philosophy, or the same kind of discussion of philosophy, and to the extent it exists, I think more on the right, it is it's hard to think of kind of current figures who are at the center of it. So do you have a sort of any kind of theory about why that might be? And is it a problem? Would it be better if we back to the time where at least sort of educated people were talking about the new philosophy book, or wondering what a philosopher had to say about.
I think that there's something good about Americans' more practical bent, but I think that we wind up in this country sort of because of the founder thing with a much more like uncritical nationalism than would be the case if people had to make reference to. If people's touchstone of like the ideas of like classical liberty and freedom weren't like also populist nationalist revolutionary leaders, but were people thinking about things in a more abstract sense who might be superseded by later figures, I think we might have some kind of healthier ideas around some of those kind of themes. But I don't know. I mean, as we were saying before, I am more a fan of practical inquiry.
Right. Well,
and I think it's good that we put that front and center in the U.S., even if it's not, always come out with the right answers.
Right. No, I think at the end of the day, policy debates typically will turn on, kind of questions closer to the ground than, again, the sort of first principles kind of debate about the kind of rights we have. Although on the other hand, you talk about something like gay marriage. That seems to be a question that's, sort of beyond what, I don't know what, I guess there are empirical claims that are made about the, somehow the effect this will have on
we have this separate thing where people have religious objections certain kinds of conduct, and then those religious objections may or may not, wane.
Right.
I mean, it's funny. It's like you can't buy like whiskey on Sunday.
Right. Sadly, tragically,
in Washington, which, I mean, it's not really because we're living in like a dystopian theocracy or something, but it's certainly, I don't know, an influence of the fact that, religion, even though nobody wants to say, oh, I read in the Bible that gay marriage is wrong, and that's the only reason I have for wanting to ban it. But, there it is.
Right.
And yet, it's the mail doesn't come on Sunday. You can't buy liquor on Sundays. I mean, people do, in fact, just sort of write Christianity into the legal code all the time when other people want to go along with them. And then sometimes, as with gay marriage, a sort of first-order claim of justice. I mean, you can't imagine. I think it's sad that we can't buy whiskey on a Sunday, but we're also not going to get in like a tearful, thing about it. It's not like an affront to my project as a human being, the way that not letting couples get married is.
But there is, I mean, you're talking about something like, issues involving, stuff like the DAT, which is a big deal right now. I mean, it seems to me like the kind of issues Parvit talks about in terms of what is owed to future persons, or, and how to choose between policies that may have differential effects on the size of the future population and the quality of the life they enjoy. I mean, these are all, it seems to me, kind of thorny issues where even if you knew all the facts about what the effect would be of, retaining this level of debt, I mean, you would not have a policy from that alone. You would have to ask questions like, if it's the case that these expenditures now will decrease growth in a way that our, children will be better off perhaps than we are, but not, but would have been really significantly better off. I mean, it seems to me you start getting into questions like, all right, is it unjust of us to saddle a future generation with debt, given that because of all the things that their forebears have created this sort of great technological infrastructure that they are born into without having done anything to deserve it? So are they, essentially entitled to that still higher standard of living, or is it okay to say you're going to be born into a world where you are only a little bit better off than your forebears were? And it wasn't unjust for us to be born, so neither is it for you to be born, even though, the debt we've settled you with, you would be better off still.
I have to agree in sympathy to politicians who just kind of say, well, it's wrong to saddle our children with this debt, even though they can't give any reasons for that. This has always struck me as one of the areas in which the conventional political philosophy curriculum is actually weakest.
Yeah.
At exploring this question about intergenerational, kind of equity and long-term population type issues. You sometimes, when people talk about climate change, at least people on the left, issues about population size come up. Someone on Twitter the other day was saying that like the number one thing you can do to reduce your carbon footprint is to not have children.
Right.
That upset a lot of people. It upset some people in part because people are upset about the idea of like coercive sterilization campaigns, obviously. But there just also is a question. It's theoretically possible that, it would be a mistake to do coercion, but that people who are having children are acting wrongly. It's also possible that that whole line of thinking is completely mistaken, and if the reason to care about climate change is that it might impair, the continued habitability of the planet, that to address it by not having the planet be habited, it's good. Well, but at any rate, I
don't think anyone's actually proposing that nobody. This is not kind of Kantian, universalized the rule and
right. But it just. I do think that there's like a lurking questions of ethical value there. And it is a situation in which similar empirical beliefs, about carbon emissions and about the likely impact of carbon emissions can still lead you to wildly different conclusions depending on what you think about quantity versus quality of human life.
Right.
Would people say things like, well, like we need to save the planet from ecological devastation? I'm never totally sure if people mean that literally or not.
I assume nobody. I mean, I think people understand the planet's going to be around, and it's really we don't.
Or something. I mean, people want to save ecosystems.
Right.
You know, I mean, people quite genuinely want to preserve the existence of the panda.
Right.
As like something, and they think that human beings should bear some cost.
Right, independent of whatever, kind of obvious benefit we gain from...
Yeah, and then of course people
where...
try to dragoon the practical considerations into this, and there's some, I mean, ecosystem collapse can have real implications for human life, but I mean, there's so few pandas already that I don't think anyone is like credibly saying that's the issue, but like people... I mean, pandas are cute. I have stuffed pandas. I love pandas, but I mean, people are motivated by the idea that we might have obligations to nature. But I think we don't see a lot of explicit discussion of what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
What is the nature of those obligations?
Right.
What might they arise from?
It's important to distinguish. So I certainly share the view that we have, moral obligations, for example, not to inflict needless suffering on other things. So I mean, you shouldn't torture a panda because that would. That's bad. It's bad when things suffer. But there's a distinct view from thinking that that there's a sort of moral obligation to kind of ensure that it's the case that there are more pandas in the future, or that pandas, the species, continue to exist, as opposed to the question of the sort of experiential quality of actually existing pandas. And I think I'm going to call my indie rock band Actually Existing Pandas.
Actually Existing Pandas. That sounds pretty good.
And also
that's like Brezhnev plus environmentalism.
I will also suggest that we're about at an hour 15, and
we should wrap it up. Wrap it up with the pandas.
All right. Any closing thoughts?
No, I'm good.
All right. Then I will see you next time. Goodbye, internets.
Absolutely. Goodbye.
Cheers.